Key to Medieval England, Part 1, Introduction to Middle English. In this lesson, we will cover the basics of Middle English orthography, vocabulary, grammar, and syntax. So, why Middle English? To clarify our terms, Middle English is a language spoken from the 12th to the 16th centuries Common Era. Old English, from around 500 to 1100 CE, was substantially different to modern English in terms of its vocabulary as well as its grammar, which was a lot more complicated than what it is today. In 1066 CE, the Norman conquest introduced a French-speaking elite, and subsequent integrating contact with English peasantry introduced much French vocabulary into the English language. And today, about 60% of modern English vocabulary is of Romance origin, coming either from Norman French or from Latin directly. English at this time also became more analytic, which means that they communicated meaning with prepositions and word order instead of changing prefixes or suffixes on words. At this time, vowels started to change slowly to how they're pronounced today, and so the language of this period is in the middle of Old and Modern English, hence the term Middle English. There were no standard rules for how to write Middle English, so people wrote just as they spoke. There was inconsistency in this, however, because as the language borrowed words from French, it also borrowed some spelling conventions. At this time, many of the vowels in words started to change to their modern counterparts. For instance, nat would change to not, which makes some words less recognizable to a modern English speaker. However, it is still worth reading them aloud if you are struggling to understand what a word is, because oftentimes it is still spelled phonetically and it can help you understand. Try and remember also that the word thorn, the letter thorn, is written almost identically to a Y. It has the th sound in modern English, so you should transcribe it as th. The dram symbol, which is that little letter on the screen there, is used for the velar fricative which no longer exists in modern English except in some dialects such as Scottish English or Scots, in, for instance, the word Loch Ness, but it's generally not found anymore in modern English. It was once used in Middle English for words which nowadays end in GHT, like knight, which was originally pronounced knecht or knicht. And common words also tend to get abbreviated in Middle English, particularly in the manuscripts. So you get lots of things which look like YT written instead of that. If you see a word with a line above, that means it has been abbreviated. I was told once that a good way to understand a Middle English text better is to imagine that you're reading a child's very messy handwriting. It is English, and they have got things correct. They just can't spell very well. If you imagine this in your head when you're reading Middle English text, it'll help you make sense of the words on the page much more easily. Middle English retains some of the verb inflections of Old English, so usually the first person singular verbs end in E, second person in st, third person in F or S, and plural verbs sometimes end in an EN. So to give an example, ich rite is I write, du ritst, you or thou writes, he, she or it readeth, he, she or it writes, we, ye, they, he written, we, you or they write. And as another example, ich love, I love, du lovest, thou or thou love, he, she, it loveth, he, she, it loves, we, ye, they, he loven, that's we, you or they love. Middle English has 4 moods, the inflectional forms of 3 of which survive in modern English. These are the indicative, subjunctive, imperative, and the infinitive, the first 3 of which survive. You don't need to know what all of these terms are, we're going to briefly explain in simplest terms what they are. So, the subjunctive survives in only a few words in modern English. The difference between the indicative and subjunctive is the same as the difference between the word can and could, or will and would in modern English. And a general rule of thumb is that Old English and Middle English use the subjunctive more than we do today. In fact, many uses of the subjunctive are now dropping out of modern English, particularly with regards to the verb to be. So, in the past, it would be more common to say, were I rich, I would buy it, whereas now we say, if I was rich, instead. Like in modern English, the imperative in Middle English is used to give commands, and it's just the stem of the verb. So you would say write or love, and that would be a command if there's no subject or pronoun with it. Some Middle English texts write the infinitive with an en ending on the stem, and they do this for participles as well. For example, written and loven, but in later texts this is shown with the preposition to, as in modern English. Word order can also be more flexible in Middle English than modern English. However, this is usually not so extreme as to obscure the meaning of a sentence. The only significant thing to bear in mind is that in verbs with more than one verb, sometimes the second verb goes at the end of the sentence. So as an example, commanded him his tale to tell in Yvain and Gawain, line 123, has two verbs, commanders and tell, and the last one of course is at the end. But as I said before, normally this is fairly intuitive and you can figure out what it means. Subordinate clauses are indicated by the same prepositions as we use in modern English, like for or that. And lastly, there are some medieval idioms and phrases which might be confusing to modern speakers, but because the word order is quite flexible, if you just go to the end of the sentence or you understand the context of whatever story you're reading, you can normally figure out what they mean. Fortunately, most of the irregular verbs in Middle English are also irregular in modern English, and they have fairly similar forms. However, there are some common words such as weten, which is to know, or expressions such as richtstrang, which is sort of right or very strong, which have fallen out of use in modern English, but they normally survive in a few isolated common phrases, such as the phrases to wit, which sort of means to be aware of or therefore, and right honourable, which we say about parliamentarians. Or they may survive in particular local dialects of English as well, because as we'll see later, Middle English was a language without a standardised dialect, so there were lots of different regions which produced Middle English texts. And lastly, there are some false friends which have different meanings in modern English. The big one is the word brand, which actually means a sword. And when you're reading literature, there can often be poeticisms which confuse the meaning, such as the word ask, which it means ash, but it's often used to refer to the spear rather than the tree because spears were made of ash shafts. Some general things to bear in mind when reading Middle English texts. Number 1. There was no standard form of the language, so you should be prepared for things to look a little different each text you're reading. Number 2. Because of this, people were writing Old English as they were speaking it, with some confusions because of the French. Number 3. If you're confused, read to the end of the sentence for context and try speaking it out loud to identify some cognates. And number 4. If you're a native English speaker, this is your language. It's not German, it's not Latin, it's not something you have to learn in school. Almost all of the words you will be able to recognise. They're words that are in our language to this day. However, if you want to be able to read medieval English texts from the manuscripts themselves, as you may access on the Parker Library link, you will have to learn to read the scripts in which they are written, which brings us to Part 2, Gothic Scripts. Probably all Middle English texts are written in some form or other of Gothic script, so you'll need to learn how to read all of its varieties. The first and most common variety is Littera Gothica Textura, which is the black letter or Gothic minuscule in English. It's a more calligraphic form of the Gothic script, used in manuscripts and printing from around 1200 to 1500 Common Era, and you can see its letter forms on the screen below. Some letters bite into each other, as in the examples DE, OR and PO below. This is admittedly quite a difficult script to read, and medieval scribes indeed had a riddle that they would write in Latin, which essentially looks like a bunch of lines all meshed together, which is a good challenge to try and transcribe. So, if you find it hard to read, understand that so did they. But, as we'll see below, there are some ways that you can get around it. My advice is to have this picture in front of you as a guide, as a reference when you're reading medieval texts. Here we have an example of it from the Travels of John Mandeville, and we can see I have transcribed the first line for you there. The city of Jerusalem standeth fair among hills. The city of Jerusalem stands fair among hills. So you can see how, for instance, there are two forms of the letter S in standards right there. The tall form is not quite so familiar to us. We also don't always necessarily know how each word should be pronounced because it's not obvious from the orthography. So, cite there. There's nothing in particular to indicate that that should be a C or a K sound, although generally a C followed by an I or an E or a Y is going to be pronounced soft, but that's not a hard and fast guide. Also, that letter hill is at the end there is a bit difficult to read as well. Here's another example. She was not with the least of her stature, but all her limbs so well answering weren to womanhood that creature. She was not with the least of her stature, but all her limbs so well answering were to womanhood that creature. This one is, again, similarly complicated in terms of its orthography and its script. It does present some difficulties for reading, and so for instance the L and the H are quite easily confusable here, but with some practice and with some thinking through it, you can normally figure out what the text is saying. One last one that we should look at is Littera Gothica Bastarda, or Bastard or Hybrid Gothic minuscule. This is a more cursive, less formal variety of the script we've just examined, and it was also used between roughly 1200 and 1500 Common Era. Its letters tend to merge together a lot more often, and there are lines above words where they abbreviated something. And because it's used for more personal writing, there's usually a bit more variety in its letter forms. I'll give one example here to show you how difficult it can be. And this one here is from the Paston letters. It reads, "Bay that fellowship for many wold." So you can see how sometimes the letters are really quite small, like in the word many. It looks almost like squills, and there's not very much distinguishing them. And there's oftentimes a lot of idiosyncrasy. A scribe will write certain letters a bit different to everyone else just because that's how they write. So when it comes to reading something like this, as before, but perhaps more so, it's all about persistence and sticking it out and keeping on looking at it. I'll confess that I had to look at this sentence a few times before I could understand what the words meant to transcribe it for you. So if you're working on a Bastard Gothic text, it may be better to read it or to create a transcription of it rather than trying to read it out from the page itself. So, some 4 common difficulties in reading Gothic script to remember are: a lot of letters can look very similar, like the R and the S. So if you're stuck, try reading the letters aloud and see if it makes sense. So if you see something that looks like "this was a man," it probably isn't meant to say "this was a man." It's probably meant to say "there was a man." Many things get abbreviated in Middle English with superscript letters and symbols. So they'll say "and it was a man" for "and that was a man." Sometimes a single character can have different phonetic values depending on its context, like U or N. They may be written the same, like in the word none. They may look like 3 N's or 3 U's, but you know from the context and from the language what letters are supposed to stand for which sounds. And lastly, sometimes you, on the other hand, get a single sound written with different letters. So for instance, S is often written with a curved S and a tall S. Some more tips for reading Gothic are to have a picture of the ABCD letter forms in front of you as a reference and keep using this until you don't need it anymore. 2. Make a transcription of the text that you want to read, and if you can't read it from the page straight away, just keep practicing and transcribing and you will get there. If you see what looks like a bunch of straight lines written after each other, count how many there are and work out how many M's, N's or U's there could be within there and work it out. And lastly, and I can't emphasize this enough, persistence is key with this. If you keep practicing, you will get it. So I've linked here some useful links that you can use to practice. The digitized Middle English manuscripts in the Parker Library, for instance, and the British Library Digitized Manuscripts Collection, and also a National History Guide to Paleography. Now we come to our final section, which will show you how to access and navigate these web resources yourself. So this is the Key to Medieval England, Part 3, accessing medieval manuscripts online. In this part, we will find out where you can access digitized medieval manuscripts online. While there are several websites with very large digitized manuscript collections, because we're concerned in this course with those containing Middle English text, most of the large continental collections have relatively little to offer. Therefore, out of the websites which you can see on the screen presently, the 2 most important ones are British Library's digitized manuscripts page and the Parker Library on the web. So let's have a look at how to use these. Right now you're looking at the British Library's digitized manuscripts homepage. Scrolling down gives us access to the advanced search feature, which helps us limit the range of search results we get. In the keywords section, you can type in the name of a given Middle English author, such as Chaucer or Piers Plowman, or the name of a specific text if you want to find it, and it will load manuscripts with those texts. Typing in Middle English to the search engine doesn't usually load up only Middle English results, so the text feature there isn't the most helpful. The manuscript section lets you enter a specific shelf mark if you come across reference to a specific British Library manuscript that you might want to examine. And the date section is the most useful for our purposes here. With it, you can use the sliders to select a range of dates from 1300 to 1500. Of course, you can look at later manuscripts also if you should so wish, but here we're focused mainly on the manuscripts dating from 1300 rather, to 1500 Common Era. On the search results page, they list the manuscripts by order of shelf mark, but you can select to arrange them by author or title or date should you so wish. The last feature is the most useful. Here, you can scroll through the different items related to your search. At the top of our list here is additional MS 5061, containing the form of curry, one of the earliest English language cookbooks. When you click on the links, you'll be taken to a description page for the manuscript, which will give its estimated date, title, a summary of its contents, languages, physical description, ownership provenance, and a bibliography of scholarship concerning the text if you wish to do further research. When you want to look at the manuscript itself, you click View Bindings and it will take you there. Once you're in the manuscript, it will show you the manuscript reference, and if you hover over the text in the first box, it will show you a summary of the manuscript's content complete with folio numbers. If you want to go to a specific folio, go to the drop-down folio menu and select it. You can zoom in or out using buttons on the left-hand side or by scrolling up and down with your cursor over the image. And that's how you find manuscripts using the British Library digitised manuscript page. Now let's briefly examine the Parker Library on the web. Here is the homepage for the Parker Library on the web, which hosts the entire digitised collection of the Parker Library at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. This is a massive collection with a particular focus on Old and Middle English texts, so it is the most valuable resource to find Middle English manuscripts online. The easiest way to find these manuscripts is to simply type Middle English into the search bar and press enter, or if you have a specific text you want to search for, you can enter that also. There is a link in the description which brings up all 36 digitised Parker Library manuscripts containing Middle English dated from 1300 to 1500 Common Era. There was some fun text in there, including Chaucer, a Middle English verse translation of the Bible, saints' lives, and even a record of Joan of Arc's trial. You can click on any of the links to go to the manuscript facsimile with the description. Unlike the British Library website, the Parker website combines the manuscript description pages and facsimile navigator pages into one, so you simply scroll down to access the description. It gives you options to zoom in or out, find specific folios, and most manuscripts have annotations which you can turn on or off. This is the little speech icon bubble on the left-hand side, which will show you a transcription of the first and last sentences on the page. And with that, we have covered how to research medieval English manuscripts online, and you should have the ability to do so yourself. It's a long and difficult process training yourself to be able to do it confidently and quickly, but it's also a very enjoyable process, and the learning curve can be quite fun. So I hope you will find this resource useful, and that you will join us for future videos when we look at specific manuscripts and specific texts. Valete!